What's going on? I'm going to be going over the RG351V. It's a Game Boy styled retro emulation handheld that plays NES up to Dreamcast. If you enjoy new tech like this, new retro games, and EDC, consider subscribing, as only about 10% of people who watch my videos are subscribed. But for now, let's check this out. This is the RG351V, which is a vertical style handheld emulator. The vertical form is similar to something like the Game Boy or the Game Boy Color. The overall size is just a little bit larger than the Game Boy Color in every direction except thickness. So if you like the way the Game Boy Color feels, you'll like this too. The screen is a 3.5-inch 4x3 IPS display with a resolution of 640 by 480. It has decent viewing angles and gets plenty bright for most situations. It seems to have a mono speaker that's not bad, but don't expect too much out of it. Here's a sound test at full volume. For the ports, it has two USB-C ports on the bottom, one for charging and the other one is an OTG port, along with a headphone jack. On the right side of the device, it has two micro SD card slots, one for the operating system and the other for additional storage. The build quality of the plastic feels pretty good. It's not quite as premium as something from Nintendo, but it's pretty close and it doesn't feel cheap at all. It feels sturdy in the hands, like it won't break easily, though I can't guarantee that it won't. For the controls, on the front it has a D-pad, 4 face buttons, start, select, and a function button. There's also a switch style analog stick that's clickable. On the left side there's a volume rocker, and the right side has the power and reset buttons. On the back there are staggered triggers and bumpers, with the R2 and L2 being raised up just a bit more than the R1 and L1, so that you can tell the difference a little bit more easily. The face buttons and D-pad are membrane buttons that feel pretty close to the Xbox One controller, and if you've ever used a PowerA Switch controller, they almost feel identical to that. I think they're a pretty good in-between of being mushy with a little tactile bump, and it's my preferred feeling in controls. The D-pad has a pretty nice spike in it, so you know which direction you're pushing without accidentally pushing other directions. The rest of the buttons on the front are just a bit mushy, but they're all menu buttons, so it's not that big of a deal either way. The stick is the same as a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con stick, and I think it fits pretty well here, especially with it being a little bit recessed into the shell so that it has a lower profile. For the triggers, all 4 are micro switches and feel fine, but I think regular Joy-Con or Pro Controller button style would have been a bit better, as they're kinda loud, but you at least know when you have them pushed and when you didn't. Now onto the specs. As mentioned before, the screen is a 3.5-inch IPS screen. It has OCA lamination and is 640 by 480 resolution. The CPU is the RK3326 quad core at 1.5 GHz, with the GPU being a Mali G31 MP2. Has 1 GB of DDR3L RAM. The system is open source Linux, so you can put a lot of different operating systems on here. My personal favorite has been ArcOS, but there's a ton of good ones. And then again, there's the dual SD card slots, one for the OS and the other for storage for your games. The base operating system is decent, and if you just want to buy this device and not have to worry about messing around with the software, it's not a bad option. Every emulator is good except the DS emulator, and the menu doesn't work on that one, so it's just frustrating to save and load games, so it's probably not going to be great for DS. My preferred one is ArcOS, and it fixes the DS emulator menu, which makes DS games a lot more playable. and gives you a bunch of themes for the menu so you can change the way it looks. Just make it a little more personal. It adds a few different cores for emulators to make them run a little better for Dreamcast and others as well. It also has updates over Wi-Fi, so you don't have to reflash the SD card or anything like that. Now on to performance. Overall, it plays NES through PS1 perfectly, and everything should be at full speed. DS, PSP, and Dreamcast all have games that are playable, but not all of them will be. For NES, there's no problems at all. It runs great, and with the 351's 4x3 display, it looks a lot better than it does on the regular 351 or the 351M. For SNES, it looks perfectly fine and plays great. It plays pretty much all the hardest to run games as far as I'm aware. I think there were some slowdown on certain emulators, but if you switch the cores over, it worked totally fine. Now for Genesis, it runs perfectly as well, and there's no problems here. On to Game Boy Advanced, it runs great, but since the screen was originally 3x2, it does have some letterboxing unless you want to have a stretched image, but it still works fine and is a good way to play GBA. Onto PS1, there's no problems even with the hardest games to run. However, games that require DualShock won't work here since you only have one thumbstick, but I'm pretty sure that's only Ape Escape. All other games are a great experience on here. I just don't recommend FPS games that much as it's a little weird to use with only one stick. Other than that, PS1 performance is awesome. And now onto the stuff that doesn't run perfectly. For DS, it's probably one that runs the best out of the next few. You can run quite a few games. It plays popular ones like Mario Kart fine, but there are some harder to run games that aren't going to be playable. For PSP, it also has some games that are playable and you can enjoy them, but there are a lot more that aren't going to be playable and are a pain to get them to the point of being playable, so I would just look at this as a bonus unless you have a lot of free time to mess around with emulator settings. On the Dreamcast, I would look at it the same way as PSP, where most are not going to be playable. And with the base operating system, I wouldn't say any are going to be playable. I know with the Arc OS, there's a lot more cores to select from, and it does have the games running at a lot higher speed, but it's still not going to be perfect. So I wouldn't pick this up for DS, PSP, or Dreamcast. So now onto my personal opinion of the RG351V. I think it's a great handheld if you're looking for something that's similar to something like a Game Boy or Game Boy Color, and you just want to relive some nostalgia from that. If you're looking for Dreamcast, PSP, or DS, I wouldn't recommend it, but it runs everything else great. PS1 works really well on it, and it's comfortable to use. I think it's a little more comfortable than the vertical ones in the hands, so that's something to consider as well. It's definitely worth the pickup if you're looking for a Game Boy form factor, and it's only around $100. Like I mentioned before, it runs everything from NES to PS1 pretty much perfect, so it's really good for those, and it's a great layout to play all of those in. I would definitely say it's worth the money if you're looking for something with a nice 4:3 aspect ratio screen, rather than the 16:10 or the 3:2 aspects of the other handhelds that I've covered. And this one is a little more powerful than previous 4:3s like the RG350, so it's definitely a worthy upgrade if you're looking for that. That was my review on the RG351V. It's a really cool device that's great for Game Boy and PlayStation 1 games. If you enjoyed, don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe for more tech and gaming videos. Thanks for watching.